Looks like we've got a pretty good crowd.
Yes, very good. Thank you all for joining us today. I have the privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Daphne Holt. Daphne is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at HMS, and she's the co-director of the Schizophrenia Psychosis Clinical and Research Program, and she's director of the Resilience and Prevention Program. She also is involved with the Emotion and Social Neuroscience Laboratory at MGH. Dr. Holt's research focuses on understanding the neural basis of emotional function and social behavior and changes in these domains in people who are affected by or at risk for serious mental illnesses. Also, the Resilience and Prevention Program she oversees is currently developing and testing new approaches for reducing risk for neuropsychiatric illnesses and those who are vulnerable to developing these conditions. And of course, we know that there is an intersection of severe mental illness and neurodegenerative disease. So this is important for us at the McCance Center. Today, she's going to be speaking on personal space with humans and avatars, candidate markers of social functioning and targets for intervention. So Daphne, take it away.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Greg. And yeah, it's so great to be here. I love this seminar, and I always wish that I could be here more. But so I'm really pleased to present today. Hopefully, I won't go over time, but I can always stop early if necessary. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. And then, okay. All right, so yeah, today I'm actually going to focus on one line of research in my group that's really focused on understanding personal space, the neurobiology of it, and changes in personal space in people with neuropsychiatric illness and at risk for neuropsychiatric illness, and some preliminary work, some initial work that we've done testing it as kind of a marker of social functioning and something that can be perhaps altered in interventions aimed to improve social functioning. So yeah, personal space, it's something we all kind of vaguely know what it is, but I think it's not something that any of us had thought about a lot. Well, I guess we were thinking about it for a few years, but before the pandemic hit, but now obviously personal space is something that we think about all the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But personal space is defined by many investigators as the area people maintain around themselves into which others cannot intrude without causing discomfort. As you probably know, personal space is influenced by a lot of things, in a moment-to-moment way. When you're with other people, there's things like gender and social hierarchy and cultural influences. And there are actually a lot of sort of physical variables that influence personal space, like, how tall people are and differences between their heights and all of that. But it also turns out really amazingly that people have a kind of underneath all these kind of variables that can change, a bit of a trait-like preference for a certain amount of distance from other people. So there's both this kind of trait component and then these situational variables, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what is personal space for? I mean, why do we have it? So the interesting thing is that it's actually incredibly conserved over, all of the animal species, basically every animal that you can think of. And I'm sure you can think about it in your daily life when you walk through a park and a squirrel, runs away from you when you get to a certain distance. Basically, every animal, including like bees and, obviously herd animals and every kind of primate has a personal space, meaning like kind of a comfort zone into which if somebody comes in, another member of the species, a conspecific comes into that space, it creates discomfort. And so it serves clearly a basic defensive function, protecting the organism from harmful intruders. And this is just, a paper that came out not long ago in Neuron showing that even like baby zebrafish have a personal space. If a stimulus reaches a critical size or proximity, escape motor programs are engaged in these fish. So the other thing, though, that's important about personal space, it's not only about defense. There's also a kind of a subtle thing that, probably you're all aware of, that has to do with communicating certain kinds of social information. So these are just, images that I took from this manual that, business people use actually to improve their personal space sort of communication, their body language. And so it just illustrates that different types of distances and positioning yourself relative to another person can communicate different kinds of information. They have here this top one that communicates a cooperative stance, or there's the more competitive kind of way that you interact with someone, or maybe you're conveying a certain amount of independence. Now, obviously, all this stuff has been completely upended by the pandemic, right now. So, so we'll talk about that in a minute. So, despite all of these variables that can sort of affect personal space in a situational kind of context dependent way, as I mentioned, there's a kind of a trait level preference that's very automatic, very unconscious, as I'll show you in a minute, that we can measure, in the laboratory. So, and it turns out that it's extremely reliable. People, show this preference over and over again. So here's just some data just showing you 6 people's personal space size. So, it can be called interpersonal distance or personal space size. And all these people, you can see, have a particular personal space preference. And they show that over and over and over again, trial after trial. And there's incredible amounts of variability across people, which was very, mysterious to us at first. And you can see on the right-hand panel here that the stability actually lasts for a long time. That we see this stability, over the period of a year in our measurements, but people have measured it for longer than that. So just to quickly mention how we measure personal space in the laboratory, the kind of most commonly used paradigm is called the stop distance paradigm. And I'll just show you this little movie that illustrates it. So essentially what happens is somebody in the lab, your staff, research coordinator, walks slowly towards the subject. And then the subject just says stop when the coordinators reach the personal space boundary. It's as simple as that. And it seems like it wouldn't be very reliable, but it's actually extraordinarily reliable, because just for the reasons that I just mentioned, that this is a very automatic, physiologically determined boundary. And then we measure another, whoops, sorry, it's too sensitive, this thing. Another distance called D2 that helps us measure the permeability or the flexibility of personal space boundaries, which I'll talk about in a minute. So you can imagine that, that this maybe is a good way to measure personal space, but we sort of felt like, there are definitely some flaws in this measurement. There's definitely some noise that has to do with the fact that that these are, people that are different heights, they're different circumstances, different variables that we can't control very well when we do this with real people. So we decided that we would design a paradigm that was exactly the same, except in virtual reality. So we would measure personal space to avatars in a virtual reality environment. So we designed this paradigm, and we did this study to ask, obviously, the most important question here, which is, do people have a personal space to avatars? And it turns out that they actually do. And we found very strong correlations between people's personal space measurements to people versus avatars. And we measured things like their arousal response when people were closer, sort of 50% closer than their personal space boundary, 25% closer. So you can see that people had a similar arousal response to humans and avatars at these different distances. Sorry. And we measured this using both skin conductance responses, so physiologic arousal, and subjective ratings. We just asked people, how uncomfortable are you? And all of the data showed the same thing, that people have a personal space to avatars, even though you can see here in these examples that these avatars don't look like real people at all. It's not that anybody was confused and thinking that they were with a real person. So this is a very strong unconscious sort of function of our brains. So what about the pandemic? Obviously, our personal space has changed in so many different settings because of social distancing mandates. And, just the effects of being in this crisis where we've been more isolated, we've been more just generally uncomfortable being around people we don't know. How has this affected personal space? Well, we did a small study, because we couldn't do a ton during the pandemic, but we actually called back a lot of those people who were in the original VR study, which I showed you was completely done before the pandemic. And we measured everything that we measured before the pandemic, we measured in these people. And we found that personal space increased in these people, maybe not surprisingly, to actual humans. But the thing that was somewhat surprising was that people's personal space to avatars was also just as enlarged during the pandemic, suggesting that this is, again, a very automatic thing that's happening in our brains, because obviously when you're, encountering an avatar in virtual reality, there is zero danger of any kind of COVID infection. So this is something that's ingrained. And, a really interesting question that we could talk about is, what's going to happen, obviously, as the pandemic subsides? Are we still going to have this discomfort? I have to say, from my own perspective, I still feel, even though I've been vaccinated, a lot of the people around me are vaccinated. Sometimes I feel, I stiffen up when I'm in a group of people in an elevator or something like that. So it may turn out that, things are going to be different for a while, and it may be a useful marker of, how people respond as the pandemic subsides, and how people sort of readjust to whatever we end up having as our, quote, new normal. Sorry to use that phrase. But now I just want to take a step back and explain to you why I've been interested in personal space for many years now, why we've been studying it, because, it was just kind of an accident that we happened to be studying it during the pandemic. We had actually been studying it for a long time before that. So, my group has been studying schizophrenia for a long time, as Greg mentioned. And just to kind of very quickly, maybe if you're not familiar with schizophrenia, you can read some of these things on this slide, but I'll just remind you very briefly that schizophrenia is a serious mental illness that only affects 1% of the population. And it's very, very disabling in, unfortunately, a pretty large percentage of people who have this diagnosis. Unfortunately, we don't have great treatments for the most disabling symptoms of the illness. We do have some treatments for positive symptoms, but not what we call negative symptoms, which are the symptoms that really affect people's social functioning. And so the disability that has been observed in schizophrenia really has been linked to these social functioning deficits, which in turn have been linked to abnormalities in social cognition. And social cognition is kind of this almost like catch-all category that really is comprised of all the processes that our brain sort of produces to mediate sort of perception of social cues and the generation of appropriate responses to those social cues. So that includes things like facial affect recognition, understanding people's intentions, and personal space. So I'll just cut to the chase, and there was a lot of work that preceded this, but I'll just tell you the bottom line is in schizophrenia, it turns out that it's been consistently observed by our group and others that people have enlarged personal space. So they tend to stand further away from other people. And we've seen this in 3 independent cohorts in our studies, but other people have observed this as well. But the thing that's fascinating, because there are many things that people have measured that have been shown to be abnormal in schizophrenia, and sometimes you're just kind of left a little bit stumped, like, okay, that's interesting, but why? What's the reason, and why is it important? So one thing that we noticed immediately, which is the case actually with a lot of things that people measure in schizophrenia, but people don't often highlight this, is that there is tremendous variability within these groups, within the control group, within the patient group, which is similar to kind of the slide that I showed you earlier with the 6 subjects data on it. So there are many people with schizophrenia who have totally sort of normal personal space, but then there's some people who don't have schizophrenia, who are sort of healthy, who have enlarged personal space. So really the key question for us was, what accounts for this variability? So we found in people with schizophrenia that negative symptoms and more importantly, some key components of negative symptoms like social anhedonia, the lack of interest in being around other people, that seemed to correlate with personal space enlargement. And we saw this both with personal space size and also personal space flexibility, or permeability, which is the flexibility of the boundary of personal space. And we've seen this in a couple of different samples now, 3 different samples actually, that negative symptoms correlate with either or both personal space size and permeability, and social anhedonia. But the really key finding was that we found similar correlations in healthy subjects. So with a variety of different measures in different samples, we've found that in the control sample, we also see the same relationship, suggesting that there's essentially this kind of dimensional relationship across clinical, non-clinical populations between personal space and different measures of social drive. So it has this kind of Ardockian, if you will, distribution. And then we've also found, interestingly, that first-degree relatives of people with psychotic disorders also show some degree of personal space enlargement, suggesting, that there may be a genetic basis for this abnormality, and also kind of supporting this dimensionality of this change. I shouldn't even call it an abnormality, but this preference that is tied to social functioning. So then the next question really is, and that we've been studying all along, is what are the neurobiological mechanisms driving personal space and these relationships that we've observed with measures of social functioning. So again, this is something that has been studied in a variety of species, including non-human primates. And in all of this work, people have identified this network of parietal areas, kind of dorsal and inferior parietal cortex, and kind of ventral premotor frontal areas, as well as subcortical areas like basal ganglia regions and that sort of thing. And so, there's essentially a multisensory near space preferring kind of network that people have called the peripersonal space network. And so we have been studying this network in various ways. And one way, obviously, is to use functional connectivity. In this more recent study, we have found, again, evidence for this dimensional relationship between this behavior, personal space size or permeability. In this case, it was permeability that correlated with the connectivity of the peripersonal space network with the default network. And we found this pretty robust correlation in controls, patients with schizophrenia. And then obviously, if you combine the sample, the correlation is even stronger. And then we found, that, and I didn't show this, but we also in the same sample found these relationships with social anhedonia and social withdrawal. And then in the patient sample, we found this mediation relationship. So essentially that the association between the connectivity variation, the variation in PPS network connectivity and social withdrawal was fully mediated by personal space permeability. And then just to briefly tell you about some of the fMRI studies we've done using what we call the looming task. We show people faces that are looming towards them, moving away from them, and then other objects. And in those studies, we see the same network that's engaged by these stimuli during personal space intrusions. So again, what's interesting is that we find very reproducible patterns of activation within individual subjects, which is actually somewhat rare in fMRI studies. Many of you probably know. So here's one subject, subject one, and you can see that, the little blobs that we see during, in these maps, these individual subject maps are sort of remarkably consistent across different scans. But yet when we look at different subjects, subject one, subject two, subject three, the pattern is a little bit different. I mean, similar, obviously, but a little bit different across subjects. So this was really exciting to us because I think, the kind of the holy grail of psychiatric neuroimaging is to be able to look at individual subjects in this kind of detailed way where we can see reliability within subjects and then be able to compare across subjects. So we've been more recently doing some 7 Tesla work. And we've actually found evidence that these responses to personal space intrusions are organized into columns. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go quickly through this. And we've also found that these columns seem to be interdigitated with columns that respond to purely sensory information about how near and far things are. So near, far in terms of binocular disparity columns. Here it's more obvious in this blow up version. You can see these columns here are essentially, this is the overlay of the near far columns. They're interdigitated with the personal space sensitive columns. So just to conclude, I'll just mention really quickly some ongoing work. So we're interested in personal space during development because the development of personal space occurs during childhood and stabilizes during adolescence and early adulthood, which coincides with when most serious mental illness sort of emerge. So this is a really important question. We're also looking at, we're developing a wearable device with some collaborators in UMass so that we can measure personal space in real life, in vivo. Obviously, that's like extremely important to understand what's actually happening in people's lives. And then probably most importantly, we have actually been working to perturb this system. So we've done some work using mindfulness and social cognition training and shown that that can actually alter personal space size as well as social motivation. And then we've been doing, we've adapted this sort of intervention, which is a group-based intervention, to be conducted in virtual reality. And so in this, this is kind of like an exposure therapy in a way, where people may be able to overcome their discomfort with the physical proximity of others by being exposed to sort of virtual versions of being with other people. But I won't go into all of that. I'll just end with a little clip showing you what this virtual reality intervention looks like a little bit if you're actually in there with goggles. And we don't actually have people wear masks in there anymore. This is an earlier video, but you can kind of see what that's like. So yeah, just want to thank you all for listening. I know it was a little bit of a whirlwind through a lot of different data. And I just want to thank my team, the collaborators, obviously the McCance Center for supporting some of this work, and the participants of the studies. And I just want to especially highlight Mona Naziria Banaki and Roger Tutel and Sarah Zapidis, who played really central roles in the work that I showed you today.
That was wonderful, Daphne. I'm sure many people in the audience have been opened up to a brand new area, and you've kindled, I'm sure, hundreds of associations in the brains of the people attending. It's really fascinating work. So I'm going to go to the chat to see what questions have popped up, and please feel free to add more questions. This question is, how would personal space differ in different cultures, racial and religious backgrounds? If this is unconscious and brain-wired, how would you explain those differences?
Yeah, I always get that question. Yes, there are personal space differences across cultures, although they're not always what you would predict, actually. Like people's intuitive sense of what those are is not always accurate. And there's actually been some controversy in the literature about whether there are strong cultural effects or not, but they seem to be very local. It's not that all Latinx people have a certain, there's a lot of differences within what we consider, to be sort of culturally distinct areas. So, I would say when we study, we try to sort of, our small sample studies, we try to study people who are American born and raised, just to kind of eliminate that potential confound. But I think it's I'm sure, mediated through the brain, these sorts of cultural differences. And the thing is that within a particular culture, there's still a huge amount of variation. So this is kind of an overlay, kind of what you might call a higher order overlay of the basic kind of unconscious personal space preference.
Here's another question. Has there been research on personal space changes in people with insecure attachment?
Yes, Greg, I feel like I could have planted that question. Because yes, there are, and I didn't have time to talk about our own studies on that. But yes, we have found that people with insecure attachment, and we are finding this very consistently, have enlarged personal space, and they also show sort of hyper responsivity of this personal space network. We have a paper, I'll send it to you.
Oh, I'd love to see that. That's really important stuff.
Yeah, and it actually may be, and I mean, the reason I talked about the sort of negative symptoms and the social anhedonia findings with some, tentative sort of caveats is that, some of those effects may be sort of underlying and driving some of the other behavioral effects, and that's what we're really trying to figure out right now.
Right. Okay, let's see if we can get one more question in. Is personal space preference mostly dispositional, or are there components that are more situational, sensitive to changes? The COVID data clearly show.
That's like the huge question, and what percentage of it is each? I mean, it's both. I mean, the short answer, it's both. But I think, we don't know, we haven't done the modeling yet to say what percentage is sort of that dispositional thing that can't be changed easily, maybe can be changed somewhat, maybe, 10, 15% or something. And then there's the context dependent stuff, which we also see, like we are doing studies using emotional expressions in the avatars, and people stand further away from avatars that look angry, and they stand closer to avatars that look happy, so there are those context effects you can also measure to some extent in a controlled way. Wow. So stay tuned.
I wish we could have you for hours, Daphne. And I would suspect that Mark Zuckerberg and Meta they'll be calling you. All right, Jordan, we can have the next speaker. Thank you so much, Daphne.
Thank you.